Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today we are going to be hearing about the feminist sex wars, and as explained in Off Our Backs, which was a publication which went for a few decades from the States, which was amazing. We're going to hear about it from Marian Rutigliano and Karla Mantilla. So welcome to both of you, and over to you.
In the early 1980s, I was at Columbia University studying, and there was a big to-do at one point over at Barnard College, which was like right there, right next door. And I didn't know what it was about. I had a friend who was majoring in women's studies who said it had something to do with that. And I found out later that there was a magazine called Off Our Backs, which was a feminist magazine. And Karla ultimately became, a number of years later, one of the collective there who edited Off Our Backs and covered what was happening over there that at the time I didn't know what it was, but now I do. Karla?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. So happy to be here. And yes, I'll be talking about what was called at the time the feminist sex wars, which took place in Barnard College in New York City in 1982. It was the 9th conference, a series called The Scholar and the Feminist. And this particular conference was called Toward a Politics of Sexuality. About 600 people attended, nearly all women. And in this talk, I will talk first about the Off Our Backs and how it covered the conference. Then I'll kind of go over some of the contentious issues that were dealt with. And finally, I'll draw some parallels about the divisions back then between liberal and radical feminists and how they apply still today. So Off Our Backs was a feminist news journal that was published from 1970 to 2008, so a total of 38 years. During that time, it was run always by a collective of women. It was started after some women had actually raised money to start an anti-Vietnam War coffee house. But then they realized that the women's movement was very much heating up, and yet there was no coverage of it in any of the mainstream media. So there was no coverage in the mainstream media of the women's movement. So they decided that it really needed to be covered because it was such an important movement at the time. Off Our Backs ended up covering most of the events of the women's movement of that time, and even subsequently, including a wide variety of conferences that we covered, not just this conference, but all kinds of other conferences. And it was considered the paper of record for the women's movement during the 1970s and 80s. It covered also very much international topics. The subscriptions were from 50 countries across the world and really focused on women's, feminist, and lesbian issues and culture. Off Our Backs also had early coverage of women in prison, something women had not thought about much before. Women and disabilities, we had a very early issue on that, and women of color issues, and was in fact covered the first National Black Feminist Organization Conference in 1973. It also covered women's festivals, including the Michigan Women's Music Festival and women's and gay rights marches, and it was known for publishing various sides of controversies.
What drew you to this collective? Why did you become a part of it?
So I was on the collective. I was joined in 1993, so after the Barnard Conference and after these events. But my route to feminism came because I started volunteering at a battered women's shelter. And I began to see what was happening to women. And for some reason, I could see it so clearly that this was not about individual women or individual, men, but that I could see that this is a pattern. This is a pattern, something I'd seen in my own life, in my own family. And I just was, one of those women who just felt like I've got to find out more about feminism. And so Off Our Backs, I lived in Washington, D.C., which is where Off Our Backs was located. So I just called them up, and they were actually having a community feminist class, which was really neat.
Wow.
And so I just went to that, and from then I just I couldn't get enough. So I joined the collective. Okay, so Off Our Backs covered the conference. There were 4 women who attended, so they were only able to cover a handful of sessions. There was a lot of criticism for that, but I mean, it was all volunteers. We were always volunteers up until the very end, and even then it was very sparse, any kind of payment. So there's no ability to cover more. They decided as a collective to try to cover the most controversial sessions. In the coverage, and I encourage you to read about it. There will be links in the show notes that have links to the issues in which the coverage was provided. And I wasn't there at this time, so I was reading it also for the first time, and the coverage is fantastic, and it's so informative and really gives you a feel of what the issues were and what women were saying at the time. And in the coverage, they separated the opinion pieces from their actual just straightforward coverage. This woman said this woman said that, this woman said this. They tried to cover various sides of the debate, and it was a very contentious conference. And they also featured a lot of letters in the following issues where women were going back and forth about, you didn't cover this properly, or you didn't represent our side properly. And there was a lot of contention in the letters afterwards. So the main issues discussed that were of contention were, first of all, sadomasochism or BDSM, lesbian sexuality, butch femme role playing, pornography, prostitution, and what they called at the time intergenerational sex, which is just, I guess pedophilia. It really was sex with minor children. And that was not, like today, some of the more sex liberal sides were more tolerant of that than radical feminists and than they ought to be, in my opinion. They covered some of the sessions, were the opening session. I'm just going to talk about some of the main contentious ones. One about butch femme sex roles with they had another one about a radical politics of sex. This one with Gail Rubin. After her session, they had a speak out, what they called the Lesbian Sex Mafia Speak Out. That was a group who I'll describe in a minute. And then there was another session, politically correct, politically incorrect sexuality. Dorothy Allison and Joan Nessel were part of that, along with some other women. And then they covered the closing session. They had a few more sessions, but those are the basic sessions. And there I have given a link to the conference program. So that will hopefully be in the show notes as well. So you can see all the names of all the sessions. So there were 2 basic sets of I'm gonna do this from the 2 sides, the radical feminist groups and then the sex liberal side, and who were there. So the radical feminist groups were represented by a group. It was a coalition they formed called a Coalition for a Feminist Sexuality and Against Sadomasochism. And that group was comprised of 3 groups: Women Against Pornography. Dorchen Leitholt was one of the co-founders of that. Women Against Violence Against Women, and New York Radical Feminists. I actually am not clear about the names of a lot of those women, and that's one of the issues I'll talk about in a bit. The interesting thing about that coalition is that they wrote a pamphlet, and this was the source of tremendous controversy at the conference. The pamphlet was titled "We Protest," and the pamphlet, in the pamphlet, they decried, quote, "Represented at this conference are organizations that support and produce pornography, promote sex roles and sadomasochism, and have joined the straight and gay pedophile organizations in lobbying for an end to laws that protect children from sexual abuse by adults." So that was a quote taken from the pamphlet. Now, this coalition criticized the following, quote, sex liberal groups, and I'm going to use sex liberal throughout this. Take it as in quotes, because that's not, that's what they call themselves to some extent. But that title is obviously problematic. So there were 3 sex liberal groups that the pamphlets criticized at the time. These were, were forming and were fairly prominent in the women's movement. The first one was called No More Nice Girls. This was a group of women writers who published in a New York City-based publication called The Village Voice at the time. Now, the coalition pamphlet said that this group, that No More Nice Girls, have said that pornography is liberating. One of the conference planners, who was a member of this group, No More Nice Girls, Ellen Willis, was quoted in Off Our Backs as saying that women against pornography are, quote, witch hunting creeps who lie or exaggerate people's positions. I never said porn is liberating. I said it is both liberating and oppressive. It is a dialectic. So, yeah, so that was, yes.
Why were these groups, these sex liberal groups, I mean, why were they all invited? Was the purpose for them to be there, to be able to spout, or just to provide a back and forth to debate?
Well, no, it was worse than that. They actually organized the conference. They were the key conference organizers. And that's why the Women Against Pornography and the radical feminists were upset, because they were excluded from the conference. There were no sessions from radical feminists. All the sessions were from the sex liberal side.
Okay.
So that was their complaint. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, their complaint about that. Okay, so this the second group, CEDAW, is a group of San Francisco-based lesbian sadomasochists. Gail Rubin was one of the co-founders of that group. In the pamphlet, CEDAW was described as saying that seeing radical feminists as prudes and moralists, and that CEDAW sees sadomasochists as sexual radicals and sexual outlaws. So that's kind of how they were described by the coalition of radical feminists. In November of that year, the conference took place in April. In November of that year, there was a letter published in Off Our Backs by CEDAW, and they wrote, quote, CEDAW does not support the repeal of laws that protect children from sexual abuse by adults. So they're defending themselves. They wrote, CEDAW has signed a petition protesting FBI harassment of the North American Man-Boy Love Association, NAMBLA, which was the pedophile group of the time. And they added, we support the right of young people to complete autonomy and self-determination, including their right to define their own sexuality and have partners of any age they choose. So this is important, I think, because we do see a thread of this lenient, at best, leniency toward rape of children among these sex liberal groups. I think that thread has followed through to some extent. The third group criticized in the pamphlet was the Lesbian Sex Mafia, a New York City-based group of which Dorothy Allison was one of the co-founders. And she described the lesbian mafia as, quote, a coalition ranging from erotic fetishists, women who explore S&M fantasies, butch femdykes, to women who work with the sex industry. The group is not entirely S&M, so that was kind of her defense against the claims of the radical feminists. The pamphlet, the Coalition of Radical Feminist pamphlet, also targeted several women who were at the conference, or at least they named them, and that was one of the points of contention. But they were criticizing women who championed butch femme roles as well. Okay, so first, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the critiques made by the sex liberals at the conference, because there was a lot of coverage about that, about radical feminists. So they were very affronted by the fact that there's a protest and that this pamphlet existed. So there were a lot of critiques they made. I kind of summarize them in a few main points. Obviously, there's a lot more to it, and I encourage everyone to read the coverage if you're interested. Okay, so the first critique by sex liberals of radical feminists are that that radical feminists are right-wing and are conservative. So Gail Rubin said, talked about the problem of blaming pornography for the evils of the world. She said that there's a long tradition of that, citing J. Edgar Hoover, who was the FBI head at the time, who was terribly corrupt, awful, awful person. And she said that he said that pornography caused sex crimes. She cited the Pope and the Catholic Church. And so she basically grouped radical feminists with those groups. Another woman, Muriel Demon, who was there, said that radical feminists are conservative, orthodox, conformist, and controlled. A second critique by the sex liberals was the accusations of McCarthyism, which Joseph McCarthy was a senator in the United States who was famous for witch hunts against communists and censorship. So they accused the radical feminists of going after them using McCarthyite tactics and censorship. Joan Nessel said that the radical feminists use guilt by association, distortion, and censorship. She also asserted that there was a phone call to the Barnard administrators saying that there were 4 known sexual deviants speaking at the conference. However, Offerbacks did check with the Barnard Women's Center, and they said that someone did call in and said that members of the conference or conference participants were members of S&M groups, but, and I quote, the administrator said, "I didn't hear anyone call them perverts." So there was misinformation flying back and forth. Obviously exaggerations. There was a lot of heat, a lot of upset. A third criticism was that because of the coverage of the conference and because of the protests that these radical feminists made, it brought a lot of attention to the conference. And 3 major things resulted from that were negative for the sex liberal group. One is that Barnard Conference confiscated what was known then as a diary of the conference, a conference diary, which there's a link for that will be provided as well. It's still available online. And what this was a booklet that included planning committee minutes, workshop abstracts, bibliographies, and graphics. The Barnard president called this diary pornographic, and because there were some graphic images in it. So that was confiscated. It was meant to be passed out to everyone at the conference, but it was confiscated. They later on got it to women who attended the conference. I'm not sure if they mailed it to them, but it was made available. The second repercussion from the coverage of the conference and the attention was that the pamphlet, because it named names, at least one of the speakers, someone had called her work, and she was called into her office, her supervisor's office, and asked if she was a sex pervert. But the third and probably most significant repercussion was that the Helena Rubinstein Foundation, which had funded the previous Scholar and the Feminist series, withdrew their financial support. So there were some repercussions to the coverage and to the protests.
I had always wondered why they confiscated that diary, and now I know.
Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, in the end, you can see it everywhere now. It's well,
Yep.
not everywhere, but it's easily available.
Yep.
Okay, so now I'm going to talk about some of the critiques by the radical feminists of the sex liberals. And some of these are answers to their critiques. So the radical feminists contended that they were expressing disagreement, which is not the same as censorship. In a really wonderful commentary printed in Off Our Backs, that I recommend if you want to read a really impassioned discussion of the conference by a woman named Claudette Charbonneau. And I tried to track her down, but I couldn't find her anywhere. She decried about the conference the inability about this claims of censorship. She wrote in her commentary, the inability to grasp the difference between opposition and censorship. That was a problem. She wrote, pointing out that one does not agree, and the reasons why one does not agree is not the same thing as censoring. If that distinction is lost, then all possibility of an intellectual life, of discussion and inquiry is
Karla's a little frozen there. She was saying that distinction between.
Charbonneau continued.
Here we go.
What?
You froze. I didn't know how long it was going to be, so I just picked up where you left off. But go ahead. We're up to
Am I
discussion
here?
where it's lost.
Sorry. We're having a windstorm here in Virginia where I'm at, so
Okay.
hopefully if I get lost, I will get a hotspot on my phone to continue. So Charbonneau continued in her piece about addressing the fact that it was the sex liberals who reflected right-wing values. She wrote, "I don't think the positions presented at this conference were the positions of sexual radicals. I think they were sexually conservative positions, assuming that attraction must be based on differences, polarities, or dominance." So a third a point made by radical feminists over and against the sex liberals was that they felt that there was a lack of balance in perspectives at the conference. Dorchen Leitholt was reported in Off Our Backs as saying, and I thought this was an important point, she said, "If this conference would have been presented by No More Nice Girls or by the lesbian sex mafia, then they would have had every right to present only their point of view. But The Scholar and the Feminist, that series, is supposed to be representative of the movement." She continued, "I'm not protesting their inclusion, but our exclusions. I think the conference legitimizes the S&M movement by giving it approval from the academic worlds. This conference was an attempt to wrest the impetus of feminism into a direction of sexual liberation, as defined by the male left." And I think she was prescient in that. I think that's exactly what did happen. Interestingly, one of the conference organizers, Carol Vance, said that Women Against Pornography was excluded because their position was a given in the women's movement. And that's interesting that at that time, being anti-pornography and anti-prostitution was seen as the most common stance of feminists. And they felt like they were rebelling against that, in their mind, I assume, hegemony. The fourth point that radical feminists made about the conference, and I think this is most salient, is that there was a lack of political analysis by sex liberals. Off Our Backs collective member, Fran Mora, criticized the closing session for, quote, "the total failure of the conference to acknowledge that some desires are destructive and the embracing without analysis of all sexual practices that have been challenged as destructive to women." And Claudette Charbonneau in her commentary also, which again, her commentary was, as they say these days, clutch, as the kids say, clutch. She wrote, "It is possible for a group of ostensibly intelligent and well-meaning individuals to countenance notions that actually contradicts their own principles. For it is a patent contradiction in terms to advocate sexual relationships, exploiting power differentials, and at the same time to maintain that one is upholding feminist ideas that are based on opposition to such exploitation." She concluded that the conference was, quote, "undermining the intellectual foundations of the women's movement." Okay, so that's kind of my summary of the basic controversy between the two groups at this conference. And it was a big deal at the time. It was talked about for years and years afterwards. Next, I'm going to move to talking about similarities in the divisions in these sex wars in the 1980s and in the current issues around transgenderism. Okay. So after looking at the historical perspective of the Barnard sex wars, it becomes apparent that there are similar divisions that we see today in the liberal versus radical feminist approaches to transgenderism. These similarities, I believe, reflect a differing set of underlying values and ideologies that each of these groups holds. And I think that there are two ideological clusters. On the one side, there's women who see BDSM, and these it's interesting to me because these kind of ideas cluster. We've often seen them as different issues, but I think that they do cluster. So women who see BDSM, prostitution, pornography, and transgenderism see those choices as empowering. And coupled with that, or at least some subset of that group who shows leniency towards pedophilia, as we saw in the statement by Samoa about supporting NAMBLA and about the right of people to have sex with partners of any age. The other side, of course, is the radical feminist side, who sees those issues in completely opposite terms, who sees issues of BDSM, prostitution, pornography, and transgenderism as issues of male power and as oppressive at their core. I first noticed these ideological clusters in the years I spent attending the Michigan Women's Music Festival. There was an area at that festival called the Twilight Zone, which is where women who practice BDSM went to have sex parties. I'm sorry to say. But what was interesting, and I'm just looking at this from an ideological point of view, those same women tended to be pro what they called sex work or prostitution and pro pornography. It was not uncommon to see women sporting BDSM gear or even the resultant scars around the festival during those years. A sight, obviously, that I found deeply disturbing. Those women also tended to be for inclusion of trans-identified males in the festival. Later, in the later years, when it became really popular to boycott Michigan as a way of trying to force transgender inclusion, the use of the Twilight Zone diminished. It was very minimal, if at all. So what it became apparent to me is that people who saw, or women who saw BDSM, sex work, and pornography as empowering felt an affinity for transgender inclusion as well. At the conference, at the Barnard Conference, Gail Rubin noticed a similar thing when she wrote, she was quoted as saying that there were two discourses emerging in feminism at that time. And she said that radical and anti-pornography feminists are the same ones who can, quote, condemn transsexuals, casual sex, and prostitutes. So those ideas are grouped together ideologically. I believe, or at least the way I'm seeing it now, is that the reason these groups of opinions cluster together is that they have similar underlying values or ideologies. And I'm just gonna kind of offer a potential analysis. I'm sure there's a lot more to add from this and to develop, but this is just kind of to throw out some thinking points. So two underlying ideologies I see is one is that they have different views of idealism versus materialism. And those, I don't mean in the normal everyday use of those terms, but in the philosophical use. So in a philosophical world, the word idealism refers to a belief in the importance of attitudes and ideas in shaping the world. So, for example, that an idealist might believe that if poor people would simply have a better attitude about their situation, have more of a work ethic, they could work hard, save money, and get out of poverty. So that's the idea that everything's in our head, and from basically just whatever ideas you have can manifest. I think it was Oprah Winfrey believes in that kind of I can't remember the name of it, but it's there's something where if you believe something, you manifest it, which is convenient if you're already rich to believe you did it by ideas. The opposite point of view is materialism or materialist, which is the belief that people's ideas and attitudes and their material conditions arise out of their access to actual resources. So materialists would say that the conditions of poverty, the lack of jobs, lack of resources, lack of education, access to healthcare, to healthy food, that all these systemic conditions are what cause people to be poor. And that then people's attitudes, say, about saving money comes from their conditions. Like if you don't have access to all those resources, you might feel like I can't save any money, which is in fact true. It's not just you don't have the right beliefs, it's that actual material resources is what affects our life chances. So a materialist would say that changing concrete systems of power and access to resources is what changes things, not attitudes. And that people's attitudes will then change in turn as their conditions change. So you really need to have more resources in order to have a different, a more optimistic view of life. You're going to have it if you have enough money and resources and jobs and healthcare. So bringing these things to feminism, an idealist would look at prostitution or pornography and would focus on the individual's choices to participate, where a materialist view would look at the material conditions that shape a woman's life that leads her to make those choices. I mean, obviously, radical feminists are much more likely to be materialist. Transgenderism is an example of idealism in that it's the idea of being a different sex, which just lives in their heads, that supersedes the actual material reality of sexed bodies and the real world constraints that result from living in those bodies. So this kind of ideological division explains radical feminists' insistence that women's liberation depends upon the analysis of systems of power, rather than focusing on freedom of choice or consent as the source of liberation. Okay, so idealism and materialism is one kind of underlying values that I think informs these two clusters of ideas. The second one I'll talk about is libertarianism. Now, I think this is a nice way to talk, or an easy way to think about this is negative liberty versus positive liberty. And these, again, are philosophical terms. So just negative liberty is the freedom from external constraints from one's actions. So the idea is that you're most free when you don't have other people standing in your way. Freedom from rules, from laws, from coercion. And a lot of people who are libertarian don't want to pay any or very few taxes because they don't want other people imposing on them. Which, there's a certain value to that, obviously. But positive liberty, when you focus on that, you focus on that people need certain human needs in order to have the ability to even be able to act. So you need money, health, good health, housing, food, childcare, transportation. All these things are things we need in order to be able to be free to act and to accomplish our goals. So it's not just that we need to be free from interference. We also need goods because we live in a human body and we need to sustain that body in ways in order to be able to act. So people who focus on positive liberty believe that people are most free when they have their basic human needs met, while libertarians who focus on negative liberty believe people are most free when they are free from constraints. So I think that kind of split underlies some of these things too, because what I'm going to talk about is now there's the four things that the sex liberals focus on that stem from these underlying values that I think are mostly not articulated clearly, but I think that they inform all that. So sex liberals, rather than focusing on systemic change, like improving access to resources of all kinds, tend to focus on the following four kind of ideas. The first one is freedom. They're obsessed with freedom. Freedom to, because freedom from constraint, freedom from being held back. And that is as opposed to radical feminists, which focus on analysis of the systemic systems of power. So longtime collective member Carol Ann Douglas wrote in Off Our Backs about the conference, quote, "It seems to me that the conference speakers generally saw freedom of behavior as more important than freedom of thought. They considered it vital for everyone to engage in their chosen sexual behavior, but it was not so crucial for any of us to be able to develop our analysis or state our opinions about sexuality." So again, this, just leave me alone, let me do whatever I want, which is a little bit, to my way of thinking, adolescent. Like get off, like an adolescent, like get off my backs, mom and dad. I want to be free to do what I want. Meanwhile, they're provided shelter and food and all that kinds of thing. So it's people who are already in positions of privilege love libertarian philosophies and the idea to get off my backs because, which is interesting, Off Our Backs is the name of the publication. There's other reasons, but anyway, that people focus on that freedom when they already have their basic material needs met. The second kind of a focus, I think, that sex liberal groups do, not on purpose, but this is a result of their underlying ideological commitments, is that they accommodate and adapt to this current system. They take it as a given. Rather than changing structures, they just find the best, what they think is the best route to the best position for having some kind of power within the given system. So I think this is interesting too, because this is where the right wing and the sex liberals are, I see them as the same. And, you know, we're always, as radical feminists, accused of holding right wing positions, which if you look at our underlying ideologies, not at all. But in this case, I think they are similar. So right wing women take patriarchy as a given and try to find the best deal within the patriarchal structure, which, as Andrea Dworkin so eloquently described in Right Wing Women, her book, that they sell themselves to one man for protection. Sex liberals want to take the given structure we have and want to just find a perceived position of power and control within the system. They're not looking to change the system of power and the way power is meted out in patriarchy. So I've likened this to, for example, the issue of women in the military. Like the right wing position on that is to protect women from it in a paternalistic way. So women shouldn't join the military. And the liberal position is for women to participate fully in it. But neither side is seeking to abolish or diminish male violence, war, or the military altogether. Neither side even sees those as possibilities. So again, they're trying to accommodate to the system. They're not thinking about an analysis that tries to change the system and change structures of power. A third kind of feature of the liberals and sex liberals is focusing on empowerment. Again, that's within the existing structures. So one of the members of the planning committee of the conference said that the issue of S&M came up because we were asking ourselves, how do women empower themselves, get pleasure, and move away from seeing themselves as victims? And she said, we saw S&M as a way of women empowering themselves. So rather than see yourself as a victim or see the structure that's actually happening, or see the ways in which you in fact are oppressed, just take the structure and just try to find a way to see yourself differently. And the last thing that I think we all know that the liberals, sex liberals, focus on is this, which they're obsessed about, is choice and consent. And that's opposed to liberation. Gail Rubin kept focusing in her workshop on how important it was for women to have all choices about sexuality. And that she said that the main point of her workshop was that, quote, all forms of consensual sexuality should be socially acceptable. So those are the four things that I think result from these underlying ideological differences. That is, the sex liberals being idealist, thinking everything's in their head, and also being focused on libertarian kind of just freedom to do whatever they want without thinking about resources and how they're distributed.
Hey, Karla, there's a question in the chat about for women, what does freedom mean in a male-dominated world? And I think it's interesting the way you define freedom, but also just mentioned liberation. And maybe that's part of what freedom means, is that it's liberation, or is it something else?
Well, I'm not going to pretend to have an answer to that, but I can just say that, I mean, I think freedom, it's a word I think is used without really anybody explaining what they mean. I mean, the American right wing is talking about freedom all the time. And what do people mean by freedom? And I think, to me, this division between positive freedoms and negative freedoms is key, because if your idea is you should be free to do whatever you want and everyone leave you alone, that means you're kind of already in a position, if you're starving, that's your idea of freedom, is not to just have everyone leave you alone. Or if, for example, you are a child, a baby is not most free if you just abandon it. And I think having freedom be this idea that, to me, again, it strikes me as somewhat juvenile, leave me alone, but it doesn't take into account what and I think this is where it's feminist, because women have often been the primary providers of people's basic human needs, making sure children and older adults and sick people are fed and clothes washed and have health care. And so I think that it's a male conception, not always, but tends to be. The idea of freedom is just everybody leave me alone. But I think that the whole idea of freedom should be articulated much more carefully and much more clearly, because I think the word is used and we all have very different meanings about it.
Thanks.
Yeah. So that it's obviously there's a lot to talk about in this idea of freedom. So in retrospect, I just want to say that I think that obviously I'm a radical feminist, so I believe that the radical feminist analysis has proven to be the most relevant. In one of the letters to Off Our Backs by the group Women Against Pornography, Violence and Pornography in Media, they cited, which I noticed in the chat, women have been talking about choking. Well, this is very relevant. Back then, they said, there is evidence that the portrayals of women in pornography have directly encouraged a number of vicious and unsolicited acts. They wrote, large numbers of women have reported being raped, vaginally and anally, forced into oral sex, and bound or beaten against their will by men who were inspired after viewing these acts in pornography. Women Against Violence and Pornography in the Media believes that most of what our culture sees as, quote, women's sexuality has been defined by men for the pleasure of men. Part of our work focuses on an attempt to create and support alternatives to these depictions. So this rings so true today, and obviously even more so now that pornography has become so prevalent and so violent, and certainly the incident of choking, which I feel like some of these women couldn't even have foreseen something as terrible as choking becoming a normal sex act for young women. It's just, to me, the radical feminist view is so important, and the sex liberal view is so just bankrupt at this point, given what's happening to young women. Well, and to everyone. I just have one more thing to talk about, just the conclusion, what I see as what the results of this conference were at the time, and I think have they filtered down through academia. I did spend 18 years working at a academic feminist publication, which to my view was not feminist at all. And I needed money at that point. I'd worked for the movement for so long, I really didn't have much. I all of a sudden realized I was going to get old one day and I needed to have a little bit of savings. So I worked there. But I certainly observed a lot at working at that journal. And I think that real feminism was barely, if at all, apparent. So my conclusion is that sex liberal ideology has prevailed in academia since the sex wars. I believe the Barnard Conference resulted, just as predicted by radical feminists, in a takeover of feminist theory in the academy by sexual libertarians and by women who at best had only a superficial understanding of feminism, and they certainly didn't understand radical feminism. Since that time, most of academia has embraced the sex liberal perspective. In fact, if you try to bring up the radical feminist, like I did early on when I worked at that publication, I just come from Off Our Backs and I brought it up, and they literally in the meeting, everyone laughed at me. They just laughed. Interestingly, many of the women who were speakers or organizers at this conference have become some of the most prominent women's studies professors in the field, names I recognize from my years of working at an academic feminist journal: Dorothy Allison, Pat Califia, I will not call her Patrick, Ellen Du Bois, Ellis Eccles, Jewel Gomez, Linda Gordon, Joan Nessel, and of course, Gail Rubin. And the women of Women Against Pornography, their names have for the most part faded into obscurity. Their We Protest pamphlet, which was the topic of so much controversy at the conference, well, I couldn't even find it on the internet. Yet the diary of a conference, which was the conference organizers complained so much was confiscated, is readily available online today. In fact, the entire conference proceedings were published in a book titled Pleasure and Danger: Exploring Female Sexuality. But finally, and most importantly, the ideological framework developed and amplified during the sex wars of the 1980s at the Barnard Conference by the so-called sex liberals has been adopted and promoted throughout academia ever since. The liberal values of idealism and sexual libertarianism, along with freedom, accommodation, empowerment, and choice and consent, over and against the values of materialism, structural change, and liberation, those sex liberal values undergird most of women's gender studies analysis these days, although not explicitly so. They usually don't talk about it without even acknowledging that there's an ideological split. Sex liberal ideology has superseded radical feminist analysis in academia to such an extent that most women's studies students and scholars have never read even a single radical feminist text, which is why these radical feminist perspective webinars are so essential. And I contend that it is the same sex liberal ideology that arose out of the 1980s sex wars, which has led us to the debacle that is transgender ideology and practice today. And that's, we have time, I guess, for questions and comments now.
That was fantastic, Karla. I actually, had some questions in the middle, but you answered them ahead of time. One thing that somebody mentioned in the chat, and I wonder how it fits in, was I remember talk of separatism, sometimes very, very, like 4B type separatism, and talk of abandoning men and things like that. Was that part of any of the response to the, sex positive liberals at all, or how did they feel about that?
It was mentioned some at the conference, and some of the sex liberals, at least one or more, or said, they used to be a separatist, but they just, didn't like it for whatever reason. So,
okay.
No, but it really wasn't talked about a lot.
Okay, I mean, I think that kind of goes to what you were talking about, the relevance to transgenderism, where we can't possibly be separatists now because they've decided they're us.
Oh, it's all they're just two ideological clusters. One sees it, just we see the world completely differently, and we act like there's just differences on each issue, but they're really whole ways of viewing the world.
Sheila, you have a question?
Yes, I just wanted to say something about the names that Karla was talking about, which is the big names of the conference, who then became big names in academia. The most significant one, of course, being Gail Rubin, who had that crucial workshop at the conference. Now, Gail Rubin became absolutely huge. It was basically Gail Rubin and Pat Califia. Pat Califia wasn't an academic, but she became a lesbian sex therapist. She wrote a book called Sophistry, which was about how lesbians can do violence to each other, and they called it sex. So that was very unfortunate. She wrote in the, what's it called, that gay... The Advocate, the gay men's magazine, because these women were hugely popular with gay men because they promoted sadomasochism. Sadomasochism was really the main form of sexuality of gay men at this time and hugely promoted. So the men loved her, loved Pat Califia. They loved Gail Rubin too. Now, Gail Rubin was an academic, very minor one. Back in 1976, she wrote a really good academic paper as an anthropologist called The Traffic in Women. It was great. And then she obviously got dragged into or moved into sadomasochism in the late 70s, and that became her whole life. I became... well, I met her quite a bit in the mid 80s. I was at a conference in the valley in Massachusetts, where there's all those women's colleges, called the Powers of Sexuality, or the Sexuality and Power. It was always about power, 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 power. You couldn't think of egalitarian sexuality, which feminists do. That was impossible. And she spoke there. She did her stuff. When they invited me to speak, I said, that since Gail Rubin was going to be their keynote speaker, I needed to be their endnote speaker, where I could say what I thought about it. And I did that. Jan Raymond was there speaking as well, lots of other women. After the conference, they said they had wanted to publish the papers, but they couldn't because of my paper, my endnote paper, saying what it was all about. That's great. I mean, that's a win, isn't it? That's a win. The papers from that conference never got published. The next time I saw her was in 1993 in Australia, where I was doing a promotion for my book, The Lesbian Heresy, and she was brought along to that launch meeting at a conference, a big sort of basically gay conference in Canberra, because it's gay men who liked her best. And she came to the launch, but also she did a talk there, and her talk, because she's an anthropologist, was on fist fucking of the anus of gay men in slings in backroom bars. Right? So that was her talk. I was sitting up the back. And as I left the room, because there were lots of women there thinking she might be a feminist, as I left, there were women who were saying to me, what was that? What was it to do with? So it was about gay male sexuality and the promotion of gay men. Gail Rubin didn't really write books. I think there was at some point a collection of a few of her pieces put together, but she wrote very little. She wasn't very significant at all academically. She had extremely little to say, apart from her significant piece called Thinking Sex. I think that was 1984, where she said, sex with children was okay. But she was hugely lauded because she absolutely fitted into what gay men and the male establishment wanted all the way along. And she totally opposed all the values of equality and love between women that so many of us tried to create and promoted in our own lives and in lesbian feminism. So she was absolutely a tool of the patriarchy. She wrote almost nothing. She was loved. In collections, I've got at least 2 collections on my shelves of gay men's and feminist writings which have her piece at the beginning, Thinking Sex. It became the Bible. It became the Bible, and promoted all kinds of sexualized violence against children and everybody else. So that was the first piece in these collections. It was extraordinary how much she fitted into and was promoted by the whole male supremacist system. Sorry,
in
I'm
fact,
sure
one of the somebody at the conference was complaining that up until that time they couldn't get published anywhere in any feminist publication, but only in gay male publications could they get published.
She, Gail Rubin, occasional writings by her showed up in a magazine that was started later on called On Our Backs. Yeah, I mean, and they would occasionally see writings by her. There's a question in the Q&A, someone asking, do radical feminists have a shared political allegiance? For example, are all socialist, left-wing, or is it a political stance of its own? Which is a good question because it's a political analysis, but that's the question, political allegiance.
I would say that because every socialist has male stuff in it. They all have different male things. So I don't think we can neatly fit into any one, because none of them, it's like Andrea Dworkin said, that right-wing women sell themselves to one man, and left-wing people, left-wing ideologies that you should sell yourselves to all men. So I think that we have to really be wary of the male thinking in any of these already existing political ideologies. What would you say, you guys? You
gave a great talk at the last WDI conference about is that whatever you look at in terms of women's place in the world fails if you do not have a radical feminist analysis at the core of it. It's a political analysis because it talks about the relationship between oppressors and oppressed, and which leaves us open to being lambasted as conservatives or whatever else anyone wants to call us if they disagree with us. So I mean, there's no political allegiance to standard liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat, but it is at its core a material political analysis. And because, Marxism ostensibly tried to do that, sometimes, we used to get called like radical left wing, and now we're getting called radical right wing.
Mhm.
Yeah, and can I just say that at the time, in the mid-80s, we were very clear that sexual libertarianism was coming from socialist feminists. The journal that was pushing it in Britain, called Feminist Review, was definitely socialist feminist. All of the women at that conference, or pretty much, would have been seen as on the left, as part of socialism in some way, and the radical feminists were the opposition. That really, really needs to be said. And of course, the left was supporting pornography, run by the men, of course, who were supporting prostitution, pornography, and so on. So that is where it was coming from. I mean, it's a bit different from the situation now, but that needs to be understood.
I was in the UK. The US, it's just like, you could not say anything that was even remotely socialist.
I know you don't have a left and never did, but we did in this country.
It's true.
We have a few minutes left. Karla, do you have any last words that you would like to, I mean, you did such a fantastic job, but is there any last thought or a couple of thoughts you'd like to leave us with?
I just think that I've tried to be a radical feminist for so long. It's so hard to see things turn back the way they do. But I obviously think that the analysis is key. We need to keep sharpening that and keep talking about it and writing about it. And to the extent we can gain back an institution or two that we've lost so many would be really good.
Okay. My last words are what I just said have been your words all along, is that at the core of it, radical feminism is a material analysis of, we look around the world and we wonder why women are in the place that we're in.
Mhm.
And if you, and if you have any doubts about it, start with that and then see where it takes you, rather than the other way around.
Yeah.
All right. We have 1 minute to go. So unless there are any burning desires, we could probably all go make another cup of coffee 1 minute earlier.
I mean, I just would like to say thanks very, very much to Karla, because, I really wanted this talk to happen. I really wanted all of that wonderful content in off our back to be talked about. So it was great. And it was very clear from her analysis what was happening. I find it disturbing because I get very distressed. My stomach tightens at how terrible that conflict was when feminism and all we were creating was destroyed. So it's quite disturbing to listen to, but I'm ever so pleased you did it. And thank you very, very much for doing it. And thanks for Marian for organizing it.
Thank you so much, Karla. That was fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you. It's wonderful to meet with other radical feminists, however we can.